The French presidential election is just around the corner, and traditionally, a lot of candidates throw their hat into the ring, and you can understand why.
The French presidency is a unique, immensely powerful institution. In fact, experts say it is the most powerful office in the democratic world.
So how much authority and might does the French president have on the national and international stages, and what are other perks that come with the top job?
Join us for this French Connections Plus, where we look at the many powers of the French president. France is a democratic republic run by a president who's elected by direct universal suffrage. That means directly by the people. There's no electoral college like there is in the United States.
To run for president, you need to fill a certain number of requirements. For instance, you have to be a French citizen, but you don't have to be born in the country like, say, in the United States. You also have to be a registered voter and not banned from running legally, and you have to show moral dignity, although there's no official definition as to what that really is.
A candidate also needs to get together 500 signatures of support from elected officials throughout the country. That can be from a mayor, a member of parliament.
This is known as parrainage, and the idea is to avoid joker candidates. But there are some 47,000 officials who could potentially sign, so you can end up with a lot of candidates.
French presidents are elected for 5 years, and they can't serve more than 2 consecutive terms.
Not only is it the most senior and prestigious role in public life, French presidents also wield significant powers. Here's a closer look.
Moi, président de la République, je ne serai pas président de tout, chef de tout, et en définitive responsable de rien.
When he was running for office in 2012, François Hollande pinpointed a familiar critique. A French president's reach is very broad, perhaps too broad. The truth is, the president of France is a versatile leader who wears several hats and has some controversial privileges. As commander of the executive branch, he or she appoints the prime minister and presides over the cabinet. French presidents set the nation's policy agenda by proposing legislation. If lawmakers get in the way, the president can dissolve parliament or bypass it by organizing a popular referendum.
Vive la République! Vive la France!
The French president is also head of the armed forces and thus has the power to deploy troops abroad and order the use of nuclear force. The president represents France on the international scene, negotiating and ratifying treaties and overseeing the sealing of strategic business deals. At times, the president can be the physical embodiment of French foreign policy. When Jacques Chirac visited Jerusalem in 1996, his exasperation at a heavy Israeli security detail was seen as a sign of France's more pro-Palestinian stance at the time.
What do you want? Me to go back to my plane and go back to France? Is that what you want?
On top of everything, the president has an ultimate trump card, Article 16 of the Constitution, which allows the French president to assume full executive control if the nation is under a serious threat. Charles de Gaulle, who crafted the prerogatives of the top job, played down any threat.
Pourquoi voulez-vous qu'à 67 ans, je commence une carrière de dictateur?
So French presidents are in the hot seat. But do they have their fingers in too many pies?
Compared to their counterparts in other democracies around the world, French presidents have more powers than leaders in countries like Germany, the United Kingdom, even the United States. A strong president is a key feature of the Fifth Republic.
La Cinquième République, ushered in by Charles de Gaulle with the Constitution of 1958. The thinking was that France needed a strong leader to call the shots in order to avoid the parliamentary paralysis that had plagued the country for decades.
Having said that, here in France, it's actually a semi-presidential system. It has features of both parliamentary and presidential types of government.
France is a hybrid system, and the president gets the best of both worlds. Just like a prime minister in a parliamentary democracy, the president has supreme executive power and drives the nation's policy-making agenda. But at the same time, the president is the head of state, directly elected by the people and can't be voted out by the parliament.
So the French president is the big boss, a top job that comes with many perks.
There are lots of advantages to being president of France. First of all, the digs. The official residence is the Élysée Palace, located in the heart of Paris, with gilded offices and a sprawling garden. Add to that several presidential residences around the country. Once elected, the president benefits from some prestigious automatic titles like Grand Master of the Order of the Legion of Honor. But perhaps the biggest advantage to being president is the impressive legal protection that comes with it. During their 5-year term, presidents are immune from criminal prosecution. Meanwhile, presidents are allowed to grant a pardon to convicted criminals. It's very difficult to remove a sitting president, though a U.S.-style impeachment procedure is possible in cases of failure in their duties manifestly incompatible with the exercise of their mandate, which is vague and unlikely. If a president dies while on the job, next in line is the president of the Senate, who fills in while another election is organized. So it's really hard to get rid of the president, other than at the ballot box.
Once elected, the French president appoints a prime minister, but French prime ministers have a lot less power than they do in other countries. They don't even have that permanent sidekick status like the vice president does in the United States.
French prime ministers are in charge of defending the government's policy in front of the parliament and running the day-to-day affairs of the country, but it's the president who really calls the shots. Prime ministers are very much like managers, highly disposable if the president needs a quick reset.
French presidents and prime ministers usually come from the same political party. That is, unless the opposition wins a majority in parliament.
In that case, the president has to choose a ruling partner from the opposition. This is known as cohabitation, and it's an awkward sharing of executive power, very much like divorced parents living under the same roof for the good of the family.
Cohabitation is very rare in France. The last instance dates back to 1997. That's when the conservative president, Jacques Chirac, had to appoint a socialist, Lionel Jospin, as prime minister. They couldn't stand each other, and yet they had to work together for 5 years.
Cohabitation is a rare moment when the powers of the president are greatly reduced, because otherwise it's easy to wonder, does the French president have too much power? To find out more, I'm joined by Mark Perlman, France 24 senior French politics editor. Hey, Mark.
Hey, Florence.
So once a French president is elected, they really have their work cut out for them, setting the national policy agenda, representing France abroad. Can one person realistically do all these things, or do they have their hands tied because of all the responsibilities?
Well, before they enter the Élysée Palace, they certainly think they can get everything done, but all former presidents have said that it was a very steep learning curve. Once they arrive, they have to deal with pending national issues, also international issues, sometimes international crisis. So it's very, very difficult because everything here comes from the top. The Fifth Republic is built around, and the center of all this is the president. And clearly, everything comes down from him, and that's sometimes a lot for one person to shoulder.
Now, the former French president, François Mitterrand, once qualified this institution of the Fifth Republic as a permanent coup d'etat. Do French presidents have too much power?
Well, he certainly thought so when he opposed General de Gaulle, but once he entered the Élysée Palace and stayed for 14 years, he certainly thought that this was not a permanent coup d'etat, that this was perfectly democratic. The president is elected by the people, so yes, he is democratically elected, but it's true he has a lot of power, and yes, some are saying he is more akin to a monarch than to an elected president, but clearly this is a democracy.
And why are the French so attached to this style of leadership, this strong parental figure that's in charge of everything?
Well, some say it's the nostalgia from the monarchy, but that's not true. You know, the French got rid of the monarchy in a very famous way. They certainly no longer think that a king should be ruling France, but it's more in contrast to the Fourth Republic. After World War II, there was a lot of instability. Governments were staying just for a few months because this was a parliamentary regime, and there was a lot of instability. And so when General de Gaulle proposed this new constitution in 1958, clearly he was the father figure, and people thought that having a president that would rule and more stability would be much better for France. And yes, this has proven to be the case. The Fifth Republic has survived. Clearly, there is an attachment to a strong president here in France.
Now, the French can be weary of overachievers. For instance, they called the former President Nicolas Sarkozy the hyper-president. President Emmanuel Macron has been likened to the god Jupiter. Do the French just have a love-hate relationship with their president?
They do. I think they do. Clearly, you mentioned Nicolas Sarkozy. His successor, François Hollande, was elected as the quote-unquote normal president. He said, you know, we should be normal people ruling normal people. People liked this at the beginning, but at the end they thought François Hollande was too normal. And they elected Emmanuel Macron, and Emmanuel Macron clearly thinks that the way to be president is really a transcendental way of ruling the country. Clearly, some people are not happy about this. We had the Yellow Vest movement and so on. So it's a very fine balancing act. The French want to have a strong ruler, but when they feel that he doesn't listen to them, that he doesn't tend to their demands, well, they often get rid of him, but that's what elections are for.
Thanks so much, Mark, for walking us through these intricacies of the French president.
Many of you sent in your questions about the French presidency, like Mirko Stavkovic. He wanted to know why in the year 2000, the French presidential term was shortened from 7 years to 5.
Well, the idea was to renew and refresh the presidency more often and also align its duration with that of MPs, also elected for 5 years. The idea of all this was to reduce the risk of those awkward cohabitations we were talking about a little earlier. And fun fact, shortly after the presidential election, France holds its legislative elections, and if both of those go to 2 rounds, well, that means that voters have to show up 4 times in just a 3-month period.
Which is a lot of time at the polls. All right, next we have Ricky J. Mark. He wrote to say some candidates have discussed the formation of a 6th French Republic. How would that work?
Well, that would require constitutional change, but the truth is, some politicians say it's high time that France gave more power to its parliament, because currently France's legislative body is one of the weakest in the democratic world. Though it can force the resignation of a prime minister, it has very little power over the president. Remember, the president can dissolve parliament at any time and also can bypass it altogether via, for instance, a referendum.
Critics say now the French president is a kind of temporary absolute monarch, which is ironic for a country that works so hard to get rid of its king.
Well, that's all the time we have for today's show, but please keep tweeting me your questions at Flo Vilmano or reach out on social media.
And we'll see you soon for the next edition of French Connections Plus.
Your needs are changing, and so is France24.com. With articles, reports, the latest international news, all our programmes available on replay, together with live broadcasting 24/7. Intuitive, fast, and available in 4 languages. France24.com. Liberté, égalité, actualité.